Exploration of the New World, How the Discovery of the Americas Changed World History Forever, Day 2. There are five major colonial powers during this time period. England is the first, France, then Spain, then Portugal, and finally the Netherlands. England is what today we call Great Britain. It's the little island you see above France. France is the green-shaped blob towards the end of Europe. Spain and Portugal are the Iberian Peninsula, which is kind of a pink color on the map, and the Netherlands is a little blue spot towards the top of the map. These five countries are the colonial powers that start exploring the world. Up until this point, we've been focusing on where Spain and Portugal went. Spain and Portugal mainly focused on South and Central America. Meanwhile, England, France, and the Netherlands are going to focus on North America predominantly. England's going to come over and colonize the east coast of the United States. In fifth grade, you talk about the 13 colonies. This is where the English went. The French are going to predominantly focus on Canada. Eventually, they're also going to take over the central part of the United States, which they call Louisiana. Today is lots of different states. Many people in Canada still speak French, especially in the province of Quebec, where French is considered a national language. And the Netherlands, and the people there are called the Dutch, they colonized some of the different parts of the United States. For example, New York used to be called New Amsterdam, after the capital of the Netherlands. Also, some of the Dutch go down to South America and set up places to live also. Also, unlike the Spanish and the Portugal, the English, the French, the Canadians, they don't focus on Native American slaves nearly as much. They did, however, import African slaves. In fact, the Dutch brought the first African slaves to America to their colonies. The English quickly adopted slavery throughout the United States. In elementary school, you'll learn that most of slavery occurs in the southern states, but originally it occurred throughout the United States. The Americas quickly became really popular with Europeans, and so some Europeans chose to do something very strange. They chose to become like slaves. Now, they wouldn't actually become real slaves, but they became very similar. They would agree to serve someone for 7 years so they could come to America and live. They would work for that person for 7 years. They wouldn't necessarily get paid anything or much at all. And after that time, they would become freed. These guys were called indentured servants. This happened throughout the Americas. But in Georgia, there was a different type of indentured servants. Instead, these guys were guys that owed a lot of money or were low criminals, not serious criminals like murderers, but people that had done similar crimes were sent to live in Georgia, the state right below us. The French developed an unusual relationship with the Indians. It was very similar to what the Europeans had done with most of the Asians. They formed a partnership. The Indians were really good at capturing animals, and the French by this time period had realized that animal furs made for really nice fancy clothing that people would pay a lot of money for. So the French and the Indians traded for these animal pelts, or these furs. Later, the English and the French go to war over problems with their colonies, and we'll talk about this war in a few weeks. The Indians all seem to jump in and help out the French. Now, there were some Indians that helped the English, but most of the French and the Indians teamed up, and this is why the war is called the French and the Indian War. Right here, we've got a picture of French and Indians on boats together trying to find pelts, and in the bottom we have a picture of a very famous movie about the Indians and the Americans fighting. We'll talk a great deal about the French and Indian War in the future, but y'all do need to understand that the French and Indian War is one of the world's first global wars. Oftentimes we talk of World War I and World War II, but please realize the French and Indian War was fought on pretty much every continent that was known of then. Usually it was Europeans fighting, but sometimes their allies living in those continents would also team in and fight. Specifically in America, we had the Americans fighting for the British because the British controlled the United States. Canada was controlled by the French, fought for the French. Our first president, George Washington, who would later go on to fight the British in the American Revolution, fought for the British against the French in this war. We'll talk about the details next time, but England wins the war and France loses Canada to England. Many of the French Canadians choose to move to Louisiana because at the time the French owned Louisiana. Those French Canadians became known as Cajuns. Originally, they were Acadians, and then over time, as that's been said over and over and over, it became known as the Cajuns. The French, Dutch, and English colonies were controlled very differently than the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. The Spanish and Portuguese allowed king's representatives that the king chose to come and dictate affairs in the new lands. The French and the Dutch chose to allow their colonies a lot of latitude, a lot of freedom. Pretty much the colonists could do whatever they wanted to in day-to-day life as long as they weren't causing problems for everybody else. The English chose to stick to something very similar to their own government at the time. By this time period, the English had went over to a representative government, a republican type of government in which people vote for their leaders. And because of this, the English colonies were set up to where they voted for leaders in their individual colonies. Those guys would then have to answer to the king and queen, things like that. But this allowed the Americans in America to begin to see that elected government works really, really well. Because we're Americans living in America, it only makes sense that we spend some time on famous American colonies. So really quickly, we're going to talk about the two most famous English colonies. Probably the most famous is Jamestown. Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement in the New World, and it was set up to make money, kind of like the Spanish were doing. The goal of Jamestown was for everybody to live and make lots of money and be happy. But most of the people that settled there were really quite lazy, actually, and they got into a lot of troubles, and they looked like they were all going to die, and the Indians come in and they help them out. Jamestown is also where we get the very famous story of John Smith and Pocahontas. Now, please realize they don't get married, although Disney says they did. Instead, she does save his life, which is in the movie, and that's pretty much that. The other famous English colony is Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock is where the Puritans go. Now, the Puritans are who Americans call pilgrims, the guys with the funny black and white clothes and the funny black and white hats. They came over to America for a very different reason. They come over so they can have religious freedom. In Europe, last year, we talked about the fact that the Protestants and the Catholics, they hate each other and they're fighting constantly. Well, the Protestants, even they fought nonstop. You know, one group of Protestants might say, hey, y'all are evil Protestants, we hate y'all, and they fought. And so the Puritans, they were a group of people that nobody really liked. They thought you had to be really serious about your faith in God, and they oftentimes got mistreated a lot. And so they decided to come over to America where they could set up a place where they could worship God the way they wanted to. They're the guys that celebrate the first Thanksgiving and hang out with the Indians and all of that. That's the Puritans at Plymouth Rock.